May 8, 1942. Somewhere in the green-gray heave of the Coral Sea, the sky tasted of cordite and burning avgas. The wind drove a thin, stinging rain across the flight deck of USS Yorktown. Men in soaked dungarees hunched under an endless gray ceiling of low cloud as the carrier lurched on a swell that felt intent on upending the world. The carrier's island was a forest of antennae and black-streaked steel. Signal lamps clicked like insects. Below, in the hot, reeking bowels of the ship, damage control parties worked with a frantic animal calm, shoveling, jamming, patching, while topside men lashed down splintered gear and pushed away the twisted carcass of metal that had once been a plane. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's flag fluttered over the bridge, and the ship rode like a stubborn animal on his orders. From the air, Yorktown looked like a wound, a black smear across the flight deck, smoke that rose in choking columns and then, at times, thinned to a memory of itself. Pilots who'd launched from her that morning returned with eyes like radio antennas, reporting hits and scoring what they could against Japanese transports. But the price had been high. Lexington was burning beyond saving. Yorktown, for all her ruggedness and the iron in her men, had been struck and left listing. Her internal compartments filled with steam and the acrid odor of hydraulic fluid. On deck, a petty officer barked orders over the shouts, water hissing as it met flame. Below, men cranked valves until their fingers cramped, and a smell of hot copper and scorched canvas settled in every open throat. Across the radio and the open channels of naval gossip, the reports went out into the Pacific and into Tokyo. The Japanese had scored, they said, a mortal blow. Japanese air crews, operating under the fog of war and the satisfying flare of success, filed reports that made the rounds in Imperial headquarters, reports that would be read and believed. For Japan's planners, Coral Sea was supposed to be a rehearsal for a greater triumph. In their minds, the American carrier force had been seriously mauled. The reality, however, was messier and far more dangerous. The Yorktown had not sunk. She had been struck, yes, badly, but she had not gone under the waves. The crew's damage control drills, learned in blood at Wake and the Solomons and willed into muscle memory, battled chaos and bought time. The ship did not die that day. Washington and Pearl Harbor heard a different cadence. Intelligence and press filtered the same shattered facts into a narrative that hardened almost immediately. Lexington lost. Yorktown gone. The Japanese carriers unopposed. On the Japanese side, the impression hardened into confidence that two of the American fleet's big flat tops were gone or too badly mauled to fight again, a calculation that would shape plans and arithmetic in Tokyo and aboard the carriers, steaming west under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's shadow. Yamamoto, operating from the blueprint of a decisive fleet action, could not conceive of an American Navy that would simply throw a wounded carrier back into the teeth of another fight. The assumption that Yorktown was out of action was not just an observation. For Japanese strategists, it became a fact that would later be treated as gospel in their briefings for the operation against Midway. Wikipedia +1 inside Yorktown. The mood was wholly different, salvage over surrender. Men who had watched Lexington go down stubbornly refused to count their losses twice. The wardrooms and engineering trunks smelled of wet canvas and oil. In the repair shops, they welded and patched with the sort of improvisational genius that turns a catastrophe into an emergency stopgap. The Navy's leaders in Hawaii took stock fast. Estimates in the yards put Yorktown's repair time in weeks. Commander and shoreside crews measured damage in hull plates and gone wiring. But weeks would not do. The Pacific had shifted on an axis of hours. Nimitz and his staff, reading the encoded Japanese intentions and mapping them against the island at Midway, argued for urgency. If the Americans could get another carrier to sea, everything changed. Yorktown's captain and the sailors who had not yet given up on her pushed the ship toward life with a stubbornness that was almost indecent. They cannibalized spare parts, rerouted steam, and shored up bulkheads that would otherwise have meant slow, methodical repair, the kind that wins in peacetime but kills in war. When Yorktown finally steamed back into Pearl Harbor, she was not a pristine queen. She was a ship made whole by urgency and courage, deck seams scarred, boilers limping, a skeleton of her air group reassigned. Dock workers and sailors worked around the clock, their hands black with grease and their faces set like the coiled springs of a trap. The Americans took a calculation that the Japanese had not. that a ship could be made good enough to fight again in days rather than weeks. That decision, messy, bold, and plainly desperate, would be the thin filament upon which the coming battle would hang. The Japanese picture of a carrier force reduced by Coral Sea was, in the end, a picture out of date. Yorktown would not be gone long. May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Oahu. The dry dock was alive with a kind of industrial fury that no peacetime yard could ever sustain. Sparks rained down from scaffolds like orange snow as men in oil-stained overalls swung torches, rivet guns, and cables across the wounded body of USS Yorktown. The acrid scent of hot steel and salt water mixed with the sweetness of burnt paint and the tang of sweat. Beneath the tropical sun, the ship looked like a battered prizefighter brought back from the brink, her decks patched with temporary plating, her superstructure blackened and scored by Coral Sea's violence. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood on the dockside catwalk, his khaki uniform crisp despite the humidity. He had come to see the impossible done, not to inspect, not to critique, but to make sure every man in that dockyard understood one thing: speed was victory. Around him, the cacophony of drills and shouted orders drowned out all but the thoughts in his head. Intelligence had broken the Japanese codes. They knew Yamamoto was moving toward Midway and soon. The enemy expected only 2 operational American carriers. If Yorktown could be made seaworthy, the odds would narrow from certain defeat to a knife's edge. The Navy Yard commander, Rear Admiral Homer N. Wallen, met Nimitz at the edge of the gangway. Grease streaked across his sleeve. "Sir, she's in worse shape than the report said. Boilers are damaged, electrical systems shot to hell. Realistically, we need 3 months." Nimitz didn't flinch. His blue-gray eyes were steady as a gun barrel. "You have 72 hours, he said flatly. "Do whatever it takes. She sails with Task Force 17. There was no argument. Orders like that weren't questioned, they were obeyed. And so, for 3 days and nights without pause, Yorktown became the center of the Pacific War's most frenzied resurrection. Thousands of men swarmed her decks and catwalks. Shipwrights, welders, electricians, cooks pressed into labor, even Marines wielding paintbrushes and hammers. They worked by the light of floodlamps and acetylene arcs. Music replaced by the pulse of industry. Men slept in shifts of minutes. Coffee and adrenaline kept them standing. The clang of hammer on steel echoed across the harbor like the tolling of some giant bell. In the machine spaces, engineers crawled through narrow ducts, patching ruptured steam lines with anything that would hold pressure. Electricians spliced burned-out conduits by hand. Damage control officers tested fire mains while pumps thumped and hissed. Above decks, sailors scrubbed away the soot of Coral Sea, chipping, welding, repainting. It was not beauty they built. It was function. A ship that could float, steam, and launch aircraft. Nothing else mattered. One of the men, boatswain's mate 2nd Class Henry Red McAllister, later wrote in a letter home, "We didn't repair her. We resurrected her." Every man in that yard knew we weren't working on a ship. We were working on time. By May 30th, the miracle had form. Yorktown's flight deck gleamed under the morning sun. Her new skin was uneven, hastily riveted but solid. Boilers groaned with life. Fuel lines, though jury-rigged, flowed clean. Her air group, VB-3, VS-5, VF-3, assembled on Ford Island. Their planes marked, loaded, and ready. Commander John Thatch, inventor of the Thatch Weave, would lead her fighter contingent. These men understood the unspoken truth. Yorktown might not survive another battle, but she would sail to meet it. On May 30th, 1942, USS Yorktown cleared Pearl Harbor, escorted by cruisers and destroyers that trailed her like wary guardians. The sun was dropping behind the Koolau Range as the carrier's hull cut through the golden water. From shore, yard workers watched her leave, patched, limping, but alive. No cheers, just quiet pride. They had delivered her back to war. Out at sea, as night swallowed the Hawaiian horizon, Admiral Fletcher's flag was raised once more over Yorktown. The smell of paint and welding still clung to the decks. In the wardroom, officers traced maps of Midway Atoll, an outpost barely specked on the ocean surface. They knew the Japanese came in force. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, veterans of Pearl Harbor. Yorktown was one of 3 to oppose them. The ocean ahead was a sheet of ink, the stars hanging sharp and cold above the masthead. In the radio shack, a transmission from Nimitz came through, brief, encoded, impersonal, yet electric with meaning. "Proceed to Midway. Engage enemy decisively. Yorktown's engines thrummed harder. Her bow pointed north. None aboard could know it yet. But the ship they had dragged from the jaws of ruin would soon become the fulcrum upon which the entire Pacific War turned. The Pacific stretched endless and indifferent under a thin veil of early dawn mist. June 3, 1942, the morning before the storm. USS Yorktown plowed through gentle swells northwest of Midway Atoll, her bow slicing cleanly, the repaired hull creaking like an old joint under strain. On her decks, sailors moved with practiced rhythm, their eyes scanning the sea and sky for shapes that didn't belong. The air smelled of salt and machine oil. The horizon was deceptively peaceful, a canvas of blue hiding death beneath it. Below decks, the ship hummed like a living thing. Boilers roared, ventilators whispered, and every passageway thrummed with nervous energy. Men played cards half-heartedly in the mess, the laughter forced. Coffee mugs rattled with every vibration of the engines. They all knew what intelligence said. The Japanese were coming, 4 carriers strong, each with more planes than any single American flat-top could match. The crew had been told little officially, but they'd seen the maps, heard the whispers. Yamamoto's fleet was converging on Midway, and Yorktown, barely patched and still smelling of welding smoke, was steaming straight into the path of giants. Up in the ready rooms, pilots lounged in flight gear, going over maps and photographs with a kind of tense reverence. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Scouting Squadron 6 from Enterprise but now under joint coordination, stood beside Yorktown's own Air Group Commander Max Leslie. The two men shared the same unspoken thought. They were outnumbered but not outmatched. McCluskey had flown since before Pearl Harbor. Leslie had seen Coral Sea and lived to tell of it. Both men knew the next 48 hours would decide who ruled the Pacific. Above them, the flight deck was alive with motion. Ordnance crews checked bomb racks, fueling lines hissed as Avgas filled dauntless dive bombers and Wildcat fighters. The crews worked in silence except for shouted confirmations. Every man on deck understood that a single mistake, a spark, a slip, a dropped tool, could turn the ship into an inferno. The tropical heat was thick and unforgiving, baking the metal underfoot. At 0600, Admiral Fletcher stood on Yorktown's bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Task Force 17 was operating in conjunction with Spruance's Task Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet, somewhere to the northwest. Fletcher's orders were to maintain a position near Midway but remain mobile. His voice, calm and clipped, cut through the morning. Maintain air patrols. Be ready to launch on contact. No one assumes safety today. The carrier's Combat Information Center, a dim compartment lit by green screens and red bulbs, was the nerve center. Radar was primitive, unreliable beyond 90 miles, but it was better than nothing. Young operators hunched over scopes, tracing ghostly blips in the static. Every sweep of the beam might reveal the beginning of the end, or salvation. By midday, word arrived from Midway itself. PBY Catalina patrols, lumbering, long-legged seaplanes, had sighted enemy ships, not the carriers yet, but transports and escort vessels heading toward the atoll. The invasion force was confirmed. The big question remained, where are the carriers? On Yorktown's bridge, Fletcher studied the message, his jaw tightening. The Japanese plan was unfolding just as Nimitz had predicted, but the enemy air groups were still unaccounted for. They were somewhere out there, beyond the edge of sight, waiting to pounce. Fletcher turned to his staff and said quietly, "They think we're down to 2 carriers. Let's make sure they stay wrong." That night, the ship moved under blackout conditions. No light, no sound beyond the thrum of engines and the hiss of the sea. Pilots tried to sleep in their bunks but couldn't. Some wrote quick letters, folded them neatly, and tucked them into pockets they might never open again. As dawn neared, the tension aboard Yorktown became physical, a vibration in the air itself. Everyone knew tomorrow would be the day. The Japanese would come at first light, and somewhere among the fleet steaming toward them, an admiral named Chuichi Nagumo believed Yorktown was already lying on the ocean floor. He would learn otherwise soon enough. June 4, 1942, Midway Atoll. Aero 4:30 hours. The ocean was calm, deceptively gentle, as if unaware that before this day was done, it would burn. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the flag bridge of the Akagi, eyes fixed toward the eastern horizon. Around him, the air was electric with precision and ritual. Below decks, armorers loaded bombs beneath Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo planes. On the flight deck, crews moved like clockwork under the rising sun, white headbands fluttering in the wind. Japan's carrier strike force, Akagi Kaga Soryu, and Hiryu, prepared to crush what they believed to be a single, desperate American outpost, Midway Island. Nagumo's intelligence said it plainly. Yorktown was gone, sunk at Coral Sea. The Americans had only Enterprise and Hornet. It would be an overwhelming victory, a prelude to Japan's total domination of the Pacific. Nagumo's confidence was quiet but complete. The Imperial Navy's air groups had never lost a carrier engagement. At 0430, the first Japanese wave lifted off, 72 aircraft, a mixture of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and Zeros. Engines screamed across the water as they clawed into the sky. They'd strike Midway first, soften the defenses, then the invasion would follow. 200 miles away, aboard Yorktown, the morning began with the sound of a bosun's whistle and the thud of boots on deck. The air smelled faintly of coffee and aviation fuel. At 0600, word came from a Midway-based PBY. Enemy carriers sighted, bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. Admiral Fletcher's heart quickened. The moment had come. He ordered Yorktown to prepare her air group for immediate launch. In the ready rooms, pilots strapped in with the quiet gravity of men who knew what was at stake. There were no speeches, no grand farewells. Just nods, handshakes, and the mechanical sound of buckles clicking shut. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led Bombing Squadron 3, VB-3. His dauntless dive bombers were lined up like metallic birds of prey, wings folded, engines idling. The deck crew signaled the launch sequence, the smell of hot oil mixed with the salt spray. At 0700, the order came. Launch strike. Engines roared to life. One by one, the Dauntlesses leapt into the air, followed by torpedo planes and Wildcats. The deck became an inferno of motion. Prop wash, wind, and shouted commands drowned in thunder. The planes climbed into the open sky, heading north toward destiny. Far ahead, the Japanese strike group that had bombed Midway was returning, its pilots reporting, Midway damaged but still operational. Second strike required. Nagumo frowned. He had a decision to make. His planes were armed with anti-ship ordnance, torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, in case the elusive American carriers appeared. But now, with Midway not yet neutralized, he ordered the rearming of his aircraft with high-explosive bombs for a second land strike. It was a fatal decision. At that very moment, the American strike groups, from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were closing in. The sky above the Pacific was an endless chessboard, and Nagumo's carriers were about to be checkmated by fate itself. At 10:20 hours, the horizon to the north exploded in sunlight and fire. Enterprise's dive bombers, led by Wade McCluskey, dove from 20,000 feet like falling stars. Akagi Kaga and Soryu were caught with decks cluttered, bombs, fuel lines, and fully armed planes exposed. In 4 minutes, Japan's pride went up in flames. From Yorktown's radio room, operators could hear the reports. Fragments of static and screaming pilots. Direct hits on Kaga. Akagi burning. Soryu finished. The bridge erupted in subdued cheers. Fletcher, calm but fierce-eyed, issued his next order. Recover our aircraft. Prepare for counterstrike. But victory would not come so easily. At 1100 hours, while Yorktown's crew scrambled to recover her planes, radar picked up a new contact. Inbound bogies 35 miles out, low and fast. Torpedo bombers. Hiryu's revenge. The men on deck barely had time to react. Sound general quarters. The klaxon wailed through every corridor. Hatches slammed shut. Guns swiveled toward the sea. Gunners loaded belts of 20 mm and .50 caliber rounds. The smell of grease and cordite thick in the air. The enemy came in low, silver specks against the horizon closing fast. Torpedoes splashed into the water. The battle for Yorktown's life had begun, June 4th, 1942. 11:20 hours. The horizon erupted into chaos. The sound hit first, the rising, unbroken whine of approaching aircraft. Then came the shapes, streaking low over the waves. Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers from Hiryu, the last of Nagumo's carriers still in the fight. They came in at mast height, sunlight flashing off their wings. Their torpedo bays yawned open like the mouths of sharks. On the bridge of Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher steadied himself against the vibration of the ship's turning hull. "Left full rudder," he barked. The carrier began to swing hard, trying to throw off the enemy's aim. Below decks, alarms howled. Every man was at battle stations. Bulkheads sealed. Watertight doors clanged shut. The sky above became a streaked mess of tracer fire. 5-inch anti-aircraft guns thundered, their shockwaves slamming through the decks. The new Mark 37 fire control system tracked targets automatically, and the gunners trusted it with everything they had. Explosions peppered the air. Shrapnel rained into the sea. Men shouted bearings over the noise. Torpedoes. "Portside 3 incoming." At 11:27, the first torpedo struck. The explosion was deep and blunt, a single concussive blow that rippled through the ship's frame. Yorktown heaved violently, lifting to starboard, then sagging under her own weight. A column of water and oil shot skyward. Within seconds, a second torpedo found her amidships. The carrier shuddered as if punched by an invisible giant. Power flickered. Lights died across compartments. Steam hissed through ruptured pipes. "Engines down." "We've lost power," shouted the engineering officer. Smoke filled the passageways. Men staggered through corridors lit only by the orange glow of fires. In the hangar bay, aircraft fuel ignited and the air turned black and choking. Damage control crews fought back with hoses, axes, and their bare hands. One sailor, his face smeared with soot, yelled, "Get the bombs overboard!" As ordnance crews hurled live munitions off the side to prevent detonation. For 20 minutes, Yorktown lay dead in the water. Her list increased to 26 degrees. Men struggled to stay upright, slipping on oil-slicked decks. The order came to prepare to abandon ship. Life rafts and boats were swung out. Some men prayed quietly. Others simply worked until their hands bled, but the crew refused to give her up. Lieutenant Commander Clarence E. Aldrich, the ship's damage control officer, coordinated from below, voice steady, eyes red with smoke. "Pump out the port voids!" Counter-flood starboard tanks. His team fought to balance the carrier's wounded hull. Slowly, agonizingly, the list eased. Pumps roared. Bulkheads held. After an hour of struggle, Yorktown righted herself. At 13:30, the engines coughed back to life. Generators hummed weakly. She was moving again, half-speed but alive. On the bridge, Fletcher exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. The wounded ship was still in the fight. Miles away, the Japanese Hiryu launched a second strike. They believed they had sunk Yorktown, but American reconnaissance spotted their course. Fletcher, battered but unbroken, relayed coordinates to Enterprise. McCluskey's dive bombers turned toward the new target. At 15:30, Hiryu was found and destroyed, burning from bow to stern, her crew leaping into the sea as her magazines exploded. Back aboard Yorktown, smoke drifted lazily from her funnel as repair parties fought stubborn fires. The sun hung low, red and merciless. By evening, the battle was won. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all gone. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 carriers, and the tide of the Pacific had turned. But Yorktown's ordeal was not over. That night, as the American fleet regrouped, she lay adrift again, crippled but afloat. A salvage tug, USS Vireo, and destroyer stood by to take her in tow. Men whispered she'd make it home again, just like after Coral Sea. Hope was fragile but real. Then came June 6th, and the shadow of a periscope rising through the debris-strewn water. June 6, 1942. The Pacific Ocean, 240 miles northeast of Midway. The sea was glassy, almost serene, the deceptive calm that always follows catastrophe. The sky was streaked with thin white clouds drifting lazily above the wounded giant that was USS Yorktown. She floated still, scarred and silent, listing slightly to port. Fires had been extinguished. Her flight deck bore the blackened marks of battle, her island scarred but upright. The men aboard the salvage tug USS Vireo and the nearby destroyer USS Haman worked tirelessly to save her. Cables groaned as they tried to bring her under tow. The Pacific, indifferent and endless, rolled beneath them. For many of the sailors aboard, hope had returned, fragile but intoxicating. Yorktown had cheated death before. She had been written off at Coral Sea, rebuilt in 3 days, and now she had survived the most decisive naval battle in modern history. Maybe, they thought, she would come home again. Below the waves, however, another hunter was watching, Lieutenant Commander Takashige Igusa of the Japanese submarine I-168 peered through his periscope, the crosshairs shimmering in the sunlight. His orders were simple: find and destroy the crippled American carrier reported still afloat after the battle. To him this was vengeance. For Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the sea demanded balance. At 13:10 hours, I-168 slipped into position. The periscope view steadied. Through the lens, Yorktown loomed, a wounded whale flanked by destroyers. Igusa adjusted his angle. Range 200 meters. 4 torpedoes loaded. On Yorktown's deck, the salvage crew worked in shirt sleeves, unaware of the danger creeping toward them. The air was hot and heavy with the scent of diesel and salt. Men passed tools hand to hand, shouting above the groan of steel cables. A signalman aboard Hammond looked out across the waves and frowned. A dark shape, distant, barely visible. Before he could raise the alarm, the sea split open. At 13:15, I-168 fired. 4 torpedoes streaked through the deep. The first struck Hammond amidships. The destroyer's hull snapped like kindling. The blast was so violent that sailors on Yorktown's deck were thrown off their feet. The Hammond sank within minutes, her depth charges detonating underwater, rocking the carrier with secondary explosions. Then came the second impact, Yorktown herself. The torpedo tore into her starboard side, near the engine spaces already weakened by battle damage. The explosion was dull, massive, final. The ship groaned, a long, low metallic scream that seemed almost human. Water poured in. The list returned, sharper this time, unstoppable. Pumps failed. Power died. Admiral Fletcher, now aboard another vessel, received the report in silence. When an aide whispered, "Sir, Yorktown has been hit again," he only nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon. "We've done all we can for her," he said softly. "Let her go with honor." As the sun set over the Pacific, Yorktown's crew abandoned ship for the second and final time. They rowed away in silence, turning to watch the ship that had carried them through 2 great battles. Smoke drifted from her funnel like a sigh. At dawn on June 7th, Yorktown rolled slowly onto her side. The sea swallowed her without spectacle, a quiet descent into history. The ocean closed over her hull, leaving only oil and debris. Hundreds of miles away aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the news that shook him to his core. His staff reported that one of the American carriers, the same Yorktown believed sunk at Coral Sea, had reappeared at Midway and fought with full strength before finally going down. For a long time, Yamamoto said nothing. Then, turning toward the empty Pacific horizon, he murmured to his chief of staff, "If that ship fought at Midway, then the gods have truly turned against us." For the Japanese Navy, it was more than disbelief. It was revelation. The assumption that Yorktown had died weeks before had shaped every decision at Midway, every confident order issued aboard Akagi. The revelation that she had returned, repaired in mere days and still deadly, struck like a hammer blow to their faith in invincibility. Yorktown had risen from the ashes of Coral Sea to fight again, and in doing so she had helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Her last transmissions, her last flight deck scorched and battered, were the proof of something greater than luck or steel, the endurance of men who refused to let her die. As the waves rolled on over her resting place, the admiral who had once believed her gone forever understood the truth. Midway was lost, the moment he heard the words, "Yorktown is still operational."